The lecture hall filled with nervous chatter as alien students settled into their seats. Crystal beings clinked softly against metal chairs, while insectoid creatures adjusted their multiple limbs for comfort. Energy forms flickered with anxiety as they took their positions near the power outlets that fed their containment suits. Professor Krell checked his reflection in the polished metal door of his office. His green scales gleamed under the artificial lighting, and his yellow eyes held the cold confidence that had served him well for over 30 years of teaching. Today marked the beginning of another semester of advanced stellar physics. The most feared course at Galactic University. Students called it the Nightmare class. More beings had dropped out of his course than any other in the station's history. Krell took pride in this fact. Weakness had no place in advanced education, and fear was an excellent teacher. The heavy chain in his clawed hands clinked as he prepared for his entrance. At the other end of the chain lay his greatest teaching tool. Patches stirred in the corner of his office, sensing the familiar ritual about to begin. The creature was magnificent in its terror-inducing design, standing nearly 4 feet tall at the shoulder. With scales that shifted from deep purple to black depending on the lighting, Patches looked like evolution's answer to nightmares. 6 eyes arranged in pairs along its elongated skull could focus on multiple targets simultaneously. Its mouth contained rows of sharp teeth designed for tearing, and claws that could slice through most metals extended from powerful limbs. The creature's tail, thick as a tree trunk, ended in bone spikes that had once been used to crush the skulls of prey on its homeworld. For 28 years, Patches had been the perfect intimidation tool. Students who saw the beast on the first day either dropped the course immediately or became so terrified of disappointing Professor Krell that they studied harder than ever before. It was a system that worked beautifully. This semester brought an unusual challenge, however. A human had enrolled in his class. Krell had heard whispers about humans throughout the station. They were newcomers to galactic society, having achieved faster-than-light travel only recently. Most civilized species regarded them with a mixture of curiosity and dismissal. They were primitives who had somehow stumbled upon advanced technology, nothing more. Yet the rumors about humans were strange. Some claimed they formed emotional bonds with creatures other species found repulsive. Others spoke of their bizarre tendency to care for wounded animals, even dangerous ones. A few tales suggested humans could somehow calm aggressive beasts through means no one understood. Krell dismissed such stories as nonsense. Every species in the galaxy understood the basic principle of dominance and submission. The strong ruled the weak. Predators controlled prey, and teachers commanded respect through fear. Humans would learn this truth just like everyone else. The roster showed the human's name as Amy Chen. She had transferred from some backwater planet called Earth as part of a cultural exchange program. Her academic records showed promise in theoretical physics, but Krell cared little for her credentials. Intelligence meant nothing without proper discipline, and discipline came through fear. He tugged on Patch's chain, and the creature rose with fluid grace. Its movements were silent despite its size, a trait that made it even more unnerving. The beast had learned over the years to play its role perfectly. It would growl at the right moments, bare its teeth when Professor Krell needed emphasis, and generally terrify students into submission. Through the thin walls of his office, Krell could hear the varied sounds of his new class settling in. The crystalline students hummed in harmonious frequencies while the insectoids clicked mandibles in nervous patterns. Gas-based life forms whispered through their translation devices, and the few reptilian species present hissed softly to each other. He wondered if the human made any distinctive sounds. Did her species have fear responses that manifested audibly? He would find out soon enough. The door mechanism responded to his touch, sliding open with barely a whisper. Professor Krell stepped into the hallway, Patches padding silently beside him on the chain. The creature's 6 eyes swept the corridor, taking in every detail with predatory awareness. Today would be like every other first day. He would enter with his beast, deliver his speech about the demanding nature of stellar physics, demonstrate Patch's frightening capabilities, and watch as the weak-willed students fled. Those who remained would be properly terrified and therefore properly motivated. The human would be no different. Whatever strange behaviors her species exhibited on their primitive planet would mean nothing here. In the civilized galaxy, power spoke the only language that mattered. Krell paused outside the lecture hall door, listening to the conversations within. He could distinguish the various species by their vocal patterns, but one voice stood out as unfamiliar. It spoke in clear, melodious tones that seemed somehow different from the usual pre-class anxiety he was accustomed to hearing. The human was asking questions about the course material, showing interest in the subject rather than fear of the teacher. This struck Krell as either admirable courage or dangerous ignorance. He suspected the latter. With practiced precision, he activated the door controls. The portal slid open with a sharp hiss that always got students' attention. The room fell silent as Professor Krell made his entrance, Patch's chain rattling ominously in his grip. The familiar scene unfolded before him. Students pressed themselves back in their seats, some actually whimpering with fear as they caught sight of his companion. The insectoid's wings buzzed with nervous energy, while the crystal beings dimmed their internal light in submission. But something was different this time. In the third row, a small figure with brown hair and curious dark eyes looked directly at him without flinching. The human showed no signs of the terror that gripped her classmates. Instead, she seemed to be studying both him and Patches with scientific interest. Amy Chen met his gaze steadily, then let her attention shift to his beast. Her expression changed slightly, but not to fear. If anything, she looked concerned. Professor Krell felt the first stirring of unease. In 30 years of teaching, no student had ever looked at Patches with anything resembling sympathy. This human was already proving to be an unexpected variable in his carefully controlled system. He tightened his grip on the chain and prepared to begin his speech. Whatever strange ideas this primitive species had about predator and prey relationships, she was about to learn how things really worked in the civilized galaxy. Silence gripped the lecture hall like a physical force. Every alien student had witnessed Professor Krell's dramatic entrances before, but the sight of Patches never failed to reduce them to terrified stillness. The creature's presence filled the room with an aura of barely contained violence that made even the bravest beings question their life choices. Professor Krell savored the moment as he always did. Fear was a tool, and he wielded it with master craftsman precision. He allowed his yellow eyes to sweep across the cowering students, noting with satisfaction how they shrank back from his gaze. The chain in his clawed hands rattled as Patches moved beside him. The beast's 6 eyes surveyed the room with predatory intelligence, cataloging potential threats and escape routes with the instincts of a born hunter. Its scales rippled from deep purple to midnight black as the creature's mood shifted, creating an almost hypnotic display that somehow made it even more terrifying. A soft whimper came from somewhere in the back rows where a gas-based life form had dimmed its containment suit to nearly invisible levels. The insectoid student's wings buzzed in barely controlled panic, creating a low harmonic that spoke of ancient flight responses. Even the crystal beings, normally confident in their near-indestructible forms, had dulled their inner light to avoid drawing attention. But Amy Chen sat perfectly still in the third row, her dark eyes moving between Professor Krell and his beast with what looked almost like analytical curiosity. She showed no signs of the fear response that gripped every other student in the room. Instead, she leaned slightly forward as if trying to get a better view. Professor Krell felt a flicker of irritation. The human's lack of proper terror was disrupting his carefully orchestrated display of dominance. He yanked sharply on Patch's chain, causing the creature to emit a low growl that rumbled through the floor and into the bones of every being present. The sound had the desired effect on most students. Several of the smaller species actually slid down in their seats, trying to hide behind their desks. One insectoid began clicking its mandibles in what any educated being recognized as a distress signal. Amy, however, tilted her head slightly at the sound. Her expression didn't show fear, but something else entirely. She looked almost sad. "Welcome to Advanced Stellar Physics," Professor Krell began, his voice carrying the cold authority that had broken the spirits of countless students over the decades. "I am Professor Krell, and this is my teaching assistant." He gestured to Patches with theatrical flourish. The beast's tail swished once, those bone spikes catching the light in a way that promised pain to anyone foolish enough to challenge its master. Some of you may have heard stories about this course. Let me assure you that every tale of academic brutality and intellectual destruction is absolutely true. I do not coddle weak minds or comfort fragile egos. Those who cannot handle the pressure are welcome to leave now. As if on cue, 3 students immediately gathered their belongings and fled toward the exit. Their hurried footsteps echoed in the silence as they escaped what they clearly saw as imminent doom. Professor Krell smiled, revealing his own impressive collection of sharp teeth. Excellent. We've already improved the quality of this class significantly. He began pacing in front of his desk, Patches moving beside him with fluid grace. The beast's claws clicked softly against the metal floor, each sound like a countdown to violence in the minds of the terrified students. Stellar physics is not a subject for the intellectually inferior, Krell continued. It requires precision, dedication, and absolute respect for authority. Those who fail to meet my standards will face consequences. To emphasize his point, he gestured again toward Patches. The creature responded by rising to its full height and spreading its wings slightly. The membranes between the wing bones were nearly transparent, shot through with dark veins that pulsed with the beast's heartbeat. Most students pressed themselves even further back in their seats. The crystal beings actually began resonating at frequencies that suggested they were preparing for emergency teleportation. Several of the smaller species were visibly trembling, but Amy continued to watch with that same analytical expression. Worse, she was now focusing almost entirely on Patches rather than on Professor Krell himself. Her attention was supposed to be on him, recognizing his authority and fearing his power. Instead, she seemed far more interested in his beast. Professor Krell noticed something else that disturbed him. The longer Amy watched Patches, the more the creature seemed to be watching her back. Those 6 eyes, which normally remained fixed on potential threats or focused on him for commands, kept drifting toward the human student. The mathematics involved in stellar formation alone, Professor Krell said, raising his voice to recapture attention, require a level of computational ability that separates true scholars from mere pretenders. He yanked the chain again, harder this time. Patches stumbled slightly, and for just a moment its carefully maintained predator's stance faltered. The creature recovered quickly, but Amy had seen the brief display of what looked almost like pain. Her expression changed subtly. The analytical curiosity was still there, but now it was mixed with something that looked suspiciously like concern. Professor Krell found this deeply unsettling. In 3 decades of teaching, no student had ever looked at Patches with anything resembling sympathy. The beast was a weapon of psychological warfare, not an object of compassion. Furthermore, he continued, trying to regain control of the situation, the stellar classification system requires memorization of over 10,000 spectral variations. Students who cannot master this basic information within the first week will be removed from the course. Another student, a small reptilian being, gathered its belongings and scurried toward the exit. The creature's retreat satisfied Professor Krell somewhat, but his attention kept returning to the human who refused to show proper fear. Amy was still watching Patches, but now she was also observing Professor Krell's handling of the chain. Every time he yanked on it, she winced slightly. Every time the creature showed signs of discomfort, her concern became more visible. This was not going according to plan. The human was supposed to be terrified into submission, not analyzing the relationship between teacher and beast like some sort of behavioral scientist. Professor Krell decided to escalate the display. He pulled hard on the chain and commanded, "Show them your teeth." Patches obediently bared its impressive dental arsenal, those rows of sharp fangs gleaming under the lecture hall lighting. The sight prompted fresh waves of terror from the alien students. One of the gas beings actually fled, its containment suit glowing with panic as it rushed for the door. But Amy's reaction was entirely unexpected. She looked at Patch's exposed teeth for a moment, then her gaze shifted to the chain around the creature's neck. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not with fear, but with what appeared to be growing understanding. For the first time in 30 years of teaching, Professor Krell felt that his control over the classroom was slipping away, and it was all because of one small human who refused to react the way she was supposed to. Amy tried to focus on Professor Krell's lecture about quantum mechanics and stellar formation, but her attention kept drifting to the creature chained beside the podium. Something about the beast's behavior troubled her in ways she couldn't quite put into words. The professor droned on about mathematical formulas and theoretical frameworks, occasionally jerking the chain to emphasize a point. Each time he did, the creature called Patches would tense slightly before resuming its intimidating pose. Most students saw only the fearsome predator their teacher wanted them to see, but Amy noticed different details. the way Patches held its tail, for instance. Despite its impressive size and obvious strength, the tail remained tucked low rather than held high with confidence. Amy had studied enough animal behavior in her biology courses to recognize submission postures when she saw them. Then, there were the eyes. 6 of them, arranged in 3 pairs along the elongated skull, should have been scanning the room for threats or prey. Instead, they kept glancing nervously toward Professor Krell, watching for his reactions with the careful attention of a creature that had learned to anticipate punishment. The gravitational forces involved in binary star systems, Professor Krell was saying, create mathematical complexities that have destroyed lesser minds. He yanked the chain sharply to punctuate his statement. This time, Amy was watching closely enough to see Patches flinch before the creature caught itself and resumed its threatening stance. The reaction lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was unmistakably one of fear rather than aggression. Amy felt her heart sink as understanding dawned. This wasn't a partnership between teacher and beast. It was something much darker. Around her, alien classmates continued to cower in their seats. The crystal beings had dimmed themselves to barely visible levels, while the insectoids kept their wings folded tightly against their bodies. Gas-based life forms flickered nervously in their containment suits, and the few remaining reptilian students had pressed themselves as far back in their chairs as physically possible. None of them were looking at what Amy was seeing. They were all too terrified to notice the subtle signs of an abused animal trying desperately to please an abusive handler. Professor Krell's voice grew harsher as he described the rigorous testing procedures that would weed out unworthy students. Those who fail my examinations will discover that academic failure has consequences beyond simple grade reduction. Another sharp jerk of the chain. Another barely visible flinch from Patches. Amy found herself leaning forward slightly, studying the creature's body language with growing concern. Every movement Patches made was calculated to appear threatening, while actually being completely non-aggressive. The beast was performing, playing a role it had been forced to learn through methods Amy preferred not to imagine. The realization made her feel sick. She had grown up on a farm outside of Austin, Texas, and had seen enough mistreated animals to recognize the signs. The hypervigilance toward the handler's moods, the careful positioning to avoid triggering anger. The way the creature's entire body remained tense, ready to react to commands or punishment at a moment's notice. Professor Krell was explaining something about neutron star formation when he noticed Amy's continued attention to his beast rather than his lecture. His yellow eyes narrowed with irritation. Perhaps our human student finds stellar physics insufficiently challenging, he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. Would you prefer a more basic course of study? Amy looked up at him, forcing herself to appear calm despite the anger building in her chest. No, sir, I'm following the lecture. I was just observing your companion. My companion. Professor Krell's tone suggested the word amused him. Patches is a tool, nothing more. A means of maintaining proper classroom discipline. The casual dismissal of the creature as mere property confirmed Amy's worst suspicions. She glanced back at Patches and saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. The beast was looking directly at her. Not with the predatory focus it showed when scanning for threats, but with an expression that seemed almost pleading. Those 6 eyes, which should have been alien and unreadable, somehow conveyed a depth of sadness that hit Amy like a physical blow. For just a moment, their gazes met and held. Amy saw intelligence there and awareness, and something that looked disturbingly like hope. Professor Krell continued his lecture, apparently oblivious to the silent communication happening between his student and his beast. He was describing the collapse of massive stars when he decided to demonstrate his authority once again. The forces involved, he said, yanking the chain with unnecessary violence, are beyond the comprehension of most species. This time, the jerk was hard enough to actually pull Patches off balance. The creature stumbled, catching itself with obvious effort before immediately resuming its threatening pose. But Amy had seen the flash of pain that crossed its features, quickly hidden behind the mask of predatory menace. Something deep in her chest twisted with sympathetic hurt. Without thinking, she made a soft sound of distress. It wasn't loud enough for most of the alien students to hear, but it was apparently exactly the right frequency to catch Patches' attention. All 6 eyes swiveled toward her with startling intensity. The creature's head tilted slightly as if it couldn't quite believe what it had heard. Amy realized with surprise that she was looking at an expression of wonder. Professor Krell noticed his beast's distraction and followed its gaze to Amy. His irritation was now clearly visible, but before he could comment, another student raised a trembling appendage with a question about spectral classification. Amy used the distraction to study patches more carefully. Now that she was looking for them, the signs of long-term abuse were everywhere, scars hidden beneath the scales, a slight favoring of the left hind leg that suggested an old injury that hadn't healed properly, the way the creature held its wings, not with predatory confidence but with the careful positioning of someone who had learned that showing strength could trigger punishment. When the class period finally ended, most students fled as quickly as they could manage. Amy remained seated, pretending to organize her notes while watching Professor Krell prepare to leave with his beast. The professor secured the chain with practiced efficiency, and Amy noticed how Patches immediately shifted into travel position. Head down, movements carefully controlled, ready to follow wherever it was led. The creature's transformation from classroom threat to submissive prisoner was accomplished with the smooth precision of long practice. As they prepared to leave, Patches glanced back over its shoulder one more time. Its eyes found Amy's across the emptying classroom, and she saw that same expression of desperate hope. Amy made a decision. She didn't know how yet, but she was going to help this creature, whatever it took. However long it required, she wasn't going to stand by and watch an intelligent being suffer. Professor Krell might think he understood human nature, but he was about to discover that some things about Earth's children couldn't be learned from academic files. 3 days into the semester, Amy had developed a routine. She arrived at Professor Krell's class 15 minutes early and stayed 20 minutes late, using the extra time to observe Patches whenever possible. The creature had begun to anticipate her presence, those 6 eyes seeking her out the moment Professor Krell entered the lecture hall. The other students remained properly terrified. They scurried to their seats with heads down and voices hushed, exactly as Professor Krell intended. None of them had noticed the subtle changes in Patch's behavior, but Amy saw everything. The beast still played its role as classroom intimidator, but with less conviction than before. Its growls sounded more half-hearted, and it no longer maintained the constant predatory scanning that had once kept students in a state of perpetual fear. Instead, it spent increasing amounts of time watching Amy, with what she had come to recognize as cautious optimism. Professor Krell had noticed his beast's distraction and responded predictably. The chain jerks became harder and more frequent. His verbal commands grew sharper. Several times, Amy watched him strike Patches across the snout when the creature failed to maintain proper threatening posture. Each incident of abuse made Amy's resolve stronger. Today's lecture focused on solar wind interactions with planetary magnetospheres. Professor Krell had positioned himself near the center of the classroom, Patches chained to a metal ring embedded in the floor beside the podium. The arrangement gave him freedom to pace while ensuring his beast remained visible to all students as a constant reminder of his authority. Amy took her usual seat in the 3rd row, directly in Patch's line of sight. The creature's eyes found hers immediately, and she offered the slightest nod of acknowledgement. Patch's tail twitched once, almost like a shy greeting. The lecture proceeded normally for the first 40 minutes. Professor Krell described magnetic field interactions with his usual combination of scientific accuracy and intimidation tactics. He yanked Patch's chain whenever he wanted to emphasize a particularly important point, and the creature dutifully responded with growls and threatening postures. But Amy noticed that the growls were getting weaker. Patches was tired, both physically and emotionally. The constant performance was taking its toll on a being that clearly wanted nothing more than to be left alone. Halfway through the class, Professor Krell announced a brief recess to allow students time to process the complex mathematical formulas he had been presenting. Most alien students used the break to huddle in small groups, comparing notes and sharing their continued terror of both teacher and beast. Professor Krell stepped out of the lecture hall to retrieve additional materials from his office, leaving Patches alone with the students for the first time Amy could remember. The change in the creature was immediate and dramatic. Without Professor Krell's intimidating presence, Patches seemed to deflate. Its carefully maintained predator's stance collapsed into something that looked almost like relief. The creature settled onto the floor with a soft sound that was nothing like the threatening growls it produced on command. Amy looked around the lecture hall. The other students were so focused on their group discussions that none of them were paying attention to the supposedly dangerous beast they usually feared. This might be her only chance. Moving slowly and deliberately, Amy rose from her seat and walked toward the front of the classroom. Several alien students glanced her way with expressions of horror, clearly expecting her to be torn apart by the unchained predator. Patches watched her approach with an intensity that should have been frightening. Those 6 eyes tracked her every movement, but there was no aggression in the creature's posture. If anything, it seemed curious about what this strange human might do. Amy stopped just outside the range of the chain, close enough to see the details that distance had hidden. Patches was even more magnificent up close, but also more obviously damaged. The scars she had noticed from across the room were deep marks left by claws and teeth. One of the creature's wings showed signs of having been broken and healed improperly. "Hello," Amy said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Patches tilted its head, clearly recognizing that this was different from the commands it usually received. The creature's 6 eyes blinked in sequence, creating an oddly mesmerizing pattern. Amy extended one hand, palm up, in what she hoped was a universal gesture of peaceful intent. Patches stared at the offered hand for a long moment, then looked back at Amy's face as if trying to read her intentions. The silence in the lecture hall had become absolute. Even the alien students' whispered conversations had stopped as they realized what was happening. Everyone was watching the human student attempt to communicate with Professor Krell's fearsome beast. Patches made a decision. Moving with surprising gentleness for such a large creature, it stretched its neck forward until its snout was just inches from Amy's extended hand. Amy could feel warm breath against her palm as the beast inhaled her scent, learning her individual signature. Then, with movements so careful they seemed almost reverent, Patches bumped its massive head against Amy's hand. The contact sent a shock through both of them. Amy felt the smooth warmth of scales beneath her palm, but more than that, she sensed the desperate loneliness that radiated from this intelligent being. Patches seemed equally affected, a soft sound escaping its throat that was nothing like the growls Professor Krell demanded. Encouraged by the positive response, Amy began stroking the creature's head with gentle movements. Patches leaned into the touch, its eyes closing with what looked like bliss. The alien students watched in stunned silence as the fearsome classroom predator transformed into something that resembled nothing so much as an enormous, grateful pet. Several of the smaller species actually stood on their chairs to get a better view of this unprecedented scene. Amy continued her gentle stroking, marveling at how Patches seemed to melt under her touch. The creature's entire body relaxed in ways that suggested it hadn't felt safe in years. Its tail, normally held in threatening positions, now swished lazily against the floor. Then Patches did something that made Amy's heart break with sympathy. The creature carefully maneuvered its massive bulk until it could rest its head in Amy's lap. 6 eyes looked up at her with an expression of pure gratitude, and Amy realized she was looking at a being that had been starved for kindness for far too long. She settled more comfortably on the floor, continuing to stroke Patches's scaled head while the creature practically purred with contentment. The sound was deeper than a cat's purr, but unmistakably similar in meaning. The lecture hall had become so quiet that Amy could hear the hum of the ventilation systems. Every alien student was staring at the impossible scene before them. The creature they had feared for weeks was now curled up like a giant kitten in the lap of the human they had dismissed. As just another primitive newcomer, Amy looked up to find dozens of alien eyes watching her with expressions ranging from amazement to disbelief. For the first time since arriving at Galactic University, she felt like she was seeing her classmates as individuals rather than just intimidated students. "It's okay," she said softly, addressing both Patches and the watching students. "Nobody's going to hurt you anymore." Patches made that deep purring sound again, and Amy felt the creature's complete trust in her promise. She had no idea how she was going to keep it, but she knew she would find a way. Outside the lecture hall, footsteps echoed in the corridor. Professor Krell was returning. Professor Krell's footsteps stopped abruptly outside the lecture hall door. Through the transparent aluminum barrier, he could see something that made no sense according to everything he understood about predator and prey relationships. His fearsome beast, The creature that had terrorized students for nearly 3 decades was curled peacefully in the lap of the human student. Patches looked more relaxed than Krell had ever seen it, making soft sounds of contentment while Amy stroked its scaled head with gentle movements. The other students stood frozen around the classroom, their expressions ranging from amazement to confusion. None of them were running or screaming or showing any of the proper fear responses that Patches usually inspired. Instead, they seemed fascinated by what they were witnessing. Professor Krell felt his worldview cracking like an eggshell. He activated the door controls with more force than necessary, the portal sliding open with a sharp hiss that normally would have sent students scurrying to their seats. This time no one moved. They were all too captivated by the unprecedented display of interspecies bonding happening before their eyes. "What is the meaning of this?" Professor Krell demanded, his voice carrying the cold authority that had cowed thousands of students over the years. Amy looked up at him calmly, her hand never pausing in its gentle stroking of Patch's head. "Your companion seemed distressed," she said simply. "I was trying to help." Professor Krell stared at his beast, expecting to see the familiar transformation back to intimidating predator. Instead, Patches remained exactly where it was, head pillowed in Amy's lap, 6 eyes half closed with contentment. "Patches," Professor Krell snapped, "resume position." The creature's eyes opened fully, and for a moment fear flickered across its features. But instead of immediately obeying as it had for decades, Patches looked between its handler and the human who was offering comfort. The internal conflict was visible in every line of the creature's body. "It's okay," Amy murmured, her voice so soft that only Patches could hear. "You don't have to be afraid." Professor Krell felt his authority slipping away like sand through his claws. "I said resume position," he repeated, his voice rising with anger. This time Patches did respond, but reluctantly. The creature slowly lifted its head from Amy's lap and moved back to its designated spot beside the podium. But it kept looking over at Amy with an expression that spoke volumes about where its preferences lay. The alien students began taking their seats, but the atmosphere in the classroom had fundamentally changed. They no longer looked at Patches with pure terror. Instead, they seemed curious, even sympathetic. Amy rose gracefully from the floor and returned to her seat, but her eyes remained fixed on Patches. The creature watched her movement with the desperate attention of someone afraid of losing the first kindness it had. Experienced in years, Professor Krell attempted to resume his lecture about magnetosphere dynamics, but he could feel that he had lost control of his classroom. Students who should have been hanging on his every word were instead stealing glances at his beast, seeing it with new eyes. "The mathematical complexities involved," he began, then stopped. Something in the quality of attention he was receiving felt different. Wrong. One of the crystal beings, a student who had never spoken voluntarily in class, raised a glowing appendage. "Professor, why does your companion appear distressed when you pull its chain?" The question hit Professor Krell like a physical blow. No student had ever questioned his methods before. No one had ever looked past the intimidation display to examine the underlying relationship. "The creature requires firm handling," he replied curtly. "It is dangerous if not properly controlled." Amy made a soft sound of disagreement. Not loud enough to be considered disrespectful, but clearly audible in the silent classroom. Professor Krell turned his yellow eyes on her. "You have something to add, Miss Chen?" Amy met his gaze steadily. "With respect, Professor, what I observed suggests the opposite. Your companion showed no signs of aggression when approached with kindness. In fact, it seemed desperate for gentle contact." Murmurs rippled through the classroom as other students began connecting Amy's observations with their own memories of Patch's behavior. "That's impossible," Professor Krell said, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "The beast is a predator. It understands only strength and dominance, does it?" Amy asked quietly. "Because what I saw was a frightened, lonely creature that's been forced to play a role for so long that it's forgotten how to be itself." The words hit Professor Krell with unexpected force. He looked at Patches, really looked at it for the first time in years. The creature was maintaining its threatening posture, but there was something hollow about the performance now. As if it was going through familiar motions without any real conviction. An insectoid student, emboldened by Amy's example, clicked its mandibles thoughtfully. "I have noticed that the creature's aggressive displays seem performed rather than instinctual. The timing is too precise, too responsive to your cues, Professor. Professor Krell felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. These students, his students, were analyzing his teaching methods with the same scientific rigor he demanded they apply to stellar physics. Furthermore, the insectoid continued. The creature's body language when approaching the human showed clear signs of social bonding behavior, not predatory intent. Other voices began joining the discussion. The crystal beings hummed observations about energy patterns they had detected. Gas-based life forms shared insights about chemical signatures that indicated emotional states. Even the usually silent reptilian students offered their thoughts on territorial versus social behaviors. Professor Krell realized with growing horror that his carefully constructed system of fear-based education was crumbling before his eyes. His students were no longer cowering in terror but engaging in scientific discourse about animal behavior and emotional intelligence. Amy spoke again, her voice gentle but carrying clearly through the classroom. On Earth, we've learned that cooperation and understanding often achieve better results than intimidation. Animals respond to kindness because it makes them feel safe, and when they feel safe, they're more willing to learn and grow. She gestured toward Patches, who was still watching her with obvious longing despite maintaining its required position. Your companion isn't naturally aggressive. It's been trained to appear threatening. But underneath all that conditioning is an intelligent being that just wants to be treated with respect and affection. Professor Krell found himself staring at his beast with new eyes. How long had it been since he had seen Patches as anything other than a tool? When had he stopped noticing the small signs of distress and unhappiness that were now so obvious? But the intimidation is necessary, he said weakly. Students must respect authority. They must understand the consequences of failure. A gas-based student flickered thoughtfully in its containment suit. Professor, I have achieved higher grades in courses where instructors showed patience and encouragement rather than threats. Fear makes me unable to think clearly. More murmurs of agreement rippled through the classroom. Professor Krell was witnessing something unprecedented in his decades of teaching. His students were not only unafraid, they were actively challenging his fundamental beliefs about education. Amy stood up slowly, her movement causing Patches' 6 eyes to track her hopefully. Professor Krell, what if we tried a different approach? What if instead of using fear to motivate learning, we used curiosity and support? She walked toward Patches again, and this time Professor Krell didn't stop her. The creature's entire demeanor changed as she approached, tail beginning to wag slightly before catching itself and resuming the proper submissive position. Look at your companion, Amy said softly. Really look. See how much happier it is when treated with kindness? That happiness could extend to your entire classroom. Amy knelt beside Patches and began stroking its head again. The transformation was immediate and profound. The creature melted under her touch, all pretense of intimidation disappearing as it leaned into the gentle contact. The alien students watched in fascination as Patches began making those deep, purring sounds again. Several of them actually moved closer, their fear replaced by curiosity and sympathy. Professor Krell felt something crack inside his chest. For 30 years, he had believed that strength came from inspiring fear, that respect was earned through intimidation, but watching his beast respond to simple kindness with such obvious joy made him question everything he thought he knew about power and authority. I don't understand, he said quietly. How can cooperation be stronger than dominance? Amy looked up at him with eyes full of compassion rather than judgment. Because when someone chooses to follow you instead of being forced to obey, their loyalty is real. When they learn because they want to, rather than because they're afraid not to, their understanding goes deeper. She continued stroking Patches, and the creature's contentment was infectious. Around the classroom, students who had spent weeks in terror were beginning to smile. The atmosphere was transforming from one of fear to one of wonder. On Earth, Amy continued, we have a saying. You catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. Kindness opens doors that force can never touch. Professor Krell looked around his classroom and saw something he had never seen before. His students weren't just present because they had to be. They were engaged, interested, actively participating in a discussion about behavior and learning and the nature of intelligence itself. For the first time in decades, learning was happening in his classroom not because students were afraid of the consequences of ignorance, but because they were genuinely curious about the subject matter. And it was all because one small human had shown his beast a moment of simple compassion. Dean Horak received the emergency alert during his afternoon meal, nearly choking on his synthesized protein when he read the message. Reports of a major disturbance in Professor Krell's advanced stellar physics class demanded immediate investigation. Students were allegedly in danger from an uncontrolled predator situation. The dean's forearms worked quickly to secure his meal and gather his official robes. In his 15 years of administration at Galactic University, he had never received a code orange alert from Krell's classroom. The professor's intimidation methods were legendary, but they had never resulted in actual violence. As he hurried through the station corridors toward the academic wing, Dean Horak tried to imagine what could have gone wrong. Perhaps the human student had finally triggered an incident. He had heard whispers about humans and their unpredictable behaviors around dangerous creatures. The scene outside the lecture hall was not what he expected. Instead of panicked students fleeing in terror, Dean Horak found small groups gathered in the corridor engaged in animated discussions. Crystal beings hummed with excitement, while insectoids clicked their mandibles in what sounded almost like laughter. Gas-based lifeforms flickered with unusually bright patterns, and even the normally stoic reptilian species seemed more animated than usual. Through the transparent wall of the lecture hall, Dean Horak could see the source of the disturbance, and it stopped him cold. Professor Krell sat on the floor beside his teaching podium, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled. His beast, the fearsome Patches that had terrorized students for decades, was lying peacefully with its massive head in the lap of a small human female. The creature's 6 eyes were closed in obvious contentment, while the human stroked its scaled head with gentle movements. Around them, alien students sat in a rough circle on the classroom floor, their previous terror replaced by fascination. They were asking questions and sharing observations, creating the kind of engaged learning environment that educational theorists dreamed about but rarely achieved. Dean Horak activated the door controls and stepped inside, expecting the familiar scene of cowering students and intimidating authority figures. Instead, he found himself in the middle of what appeared to be an impromptu seminar on interspecies psychology and animal behavior. Dean Horak, Professor Krell said, looking up with an expression that mixed embarrassment with something that might have been relief. I can explain. But before the professor could speak further, the human student looked up and smiled. Hello, Dean. I'm Amy Chen. I hope we haven't caused too much concern. Dean Horak stared at the scene before him. The creature that had been the subject of cautionary tales for 3 decades was making soft purring sounds while snuggled against a human who couldn't weigh more than a fraction of its bulk. What exactly is happening here? He asked, his voice carefully neutral. Amy's hand never paused in its gentle stroking. We're learning about the difference between forced compliance and willing cooperation. It turns out that Professor Krell's companion is much happier when treated with kindness, rather than used as an intimidation tool. An insectoid student raised multiple appendages eagerly. Dean Horak, the human, has demonstrated remarkable insights into behavioral psychology. She showed us that what we interpreted as predatory aggression was actually learned performance designed to please an authority figure. Furthermore, added a crystal being, its internal light pulsing with excitement, the emotional intelligence displayed by both human and creature suggests that our understanding of interspecies communication has been severely limited. Dean Horak felt the foundations of his administrative worldview shifting. These were the same students who had filed formal complaints about Professor Krell's intimidation tactics for years. Now they were praising the educational value of his classroom. Professor Krell spoke quietly from his position on the floor. Dean, I believe I have been wrong about many things. This human has shown me that strength through fear is not the same as true authority earned through respect. Amy looked around the circle of engaged students. What happened here today wasn't just about kindness to animals. It was about recognizing that every intelligent being deserves to be treated with dignity. Whether they're students or teachers or companions, she addressed Professor Krell directly. You have incredible knowledge about stellar physics. Your students could learn so much more if they weren't afraid of you. Fear makes it hard to think clearly or ask questions or admit when you don't understand something. One of the gas-based students flickered agreement. I have wanted to ask questions for weeks, but I was too frightened of appearing ignorant. Questions are how we learn, Amy said simply. There's no shame in not knowing something. The shame is in being too afraid to find out. Dean Horak watched as Professor Krell absorbed these words. The elderly professor had built his reputation on academic rigor and demanding standards. But somewhere along the way, he had confused fear with respect. Patches stirred in Amy's lap, looking up at Professor Krell with an expression that no longer held wariness. The creature seemed to sense the change in its handler's demeanor, the gradual relaxation of decades of enforced dominance. "Professor," Amy said gently, "would you like to try petting your companion? I think it would like that very much." Professor Krell hesitated for a moment, then slowly extended one clawed hand toward Patches. The creature watched his approach without flinching, and when Krell's scaled fingers made contact with its head, Patches leaned into the touch with obvious pleasure. For the first time in nearly 30 years, Professor Krell touched his beast with gentleness rather than control. The creature's response was immediate and profound, a deep rumbling purr that seemed to come from the very core of its being. Tears gathered in Professor Krell's yellow eyes as he realized how much happiness he had denied both himself and his companion through his rigid adherence to dominance-based thinking. Dean Horak cleared his throat softly. "Miss Chen, I believe the university would benefit greatly from your unique perspective. Would you be interested in developing a new course on interspecies communication and behavioral psychology?" Amy's face lit up with excitement. "I would love that. And perhaps Patches could be our teaching assistant, not as an intimidation tool, but as an example of how trust and understanding can bridge the gap between different forms of intelligence." Professor Krell looked down at his beast, now purring contentedly under the combined attention of human and handler. "I think Patches would like that very much." Around the circle, alien students began sharing their own stories about fear and learning, authority and respect. The conversation that followed was unlike anything that had ever happened in the advanced physics classroom. As the impromptu seminar continued, Dean Horak realized he was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic education. The humans had brought more than just technological advancement to their society. They had brought a fundamentally different way of approaching relationships and learning. 3 months later, the course Interspecies Psychology and Cooperative Learning had a waiting list that stretched across multiple star systems. Professor Krell had become one of the most popular instructors at Galactic University, not through fear, but through the kind of passionate teaching that happened when both instructor and students felt safe enough to explore ideas together. Patches, now officially recognized as an educational companion rather than an intimidation tool, had become something of a celebrity. Students from across the galaxy came to visit the creature that had learned to trust again, and in doing so, had taught an entire civilization about the power of compassion. Amy often found herself reflecting on that first day, when she had simply offered kindness to a frightened creature. She had come to Galactic University to learn about stellar physics, but instead she had taught an entire society something far more valuable. Sometimes the greatest strength wasn't in being feared, but in being brave enough to show compassion to those who needed it most.